The place card wasn't missing. I found that out the hard way, standing at the edge of the head table with a glass of sparkling water sweating in my hand, running my finger down a row of names printed in gold script that didn't include mine. I checked it 3 times. Pharaoh, 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 my father, my mother, my brother, each one anchored to a chair with a little calligraphed tent card. And then a gap. A single empty setting between my mother and an assistant fire chief I'd never met. No card at all, like the caterer had simply run out of room and decided the leftover chair could sit there unclaimed for the rest of the night. I didn't make a scene. I don't do scenes. I've spent 14 years learning how to keep my face perfectly still while alarms are going off in 3 different systems at once. And that training doesn't switch off just because the crisis is a seating chart instead of a substation. I found Priya near the gift table instead, clipboard against her chest, radio clipped to her hip. The exact posture of someone who has spent the last 6 hours absorbing other people's problems. She was the event coordinator Hector's office had hired, a woman I liked, which made what came next worse. Hey, I said. I think there's a mix-up with the head table. I'm not on it. She didn't check the clipboard. That was the first thing that told me. She already knew, Mari. She said my name carefully, like it might detonate. Your dad asked me to seat you at table 9, with the Reyes family. He said. She stopped, recalibrated, tried again. He wanted tonight to stay focused on Nico's announcement. He didn't want anything pulling attention away from that, anything. I noted the word. Not anyone. Anything. Like I was a loose folding chair someone had to route around. He asked you that himself, I said. Not a question. I wanted her to have to say it out loud, because I already knew she wasn't going to lie to me, and I wanted to hear exactly how it had been phrased, in case I ever needed to remember it precisely, this afternoon. Before the doors opened. Priya's eyes were apologetic in a way that made my stomach drop lower than the actual snub did. She'd known for hours. She'd watched me walk in an hour ago in the navy dress I'd bought for this, and she'd known. I thanked her. I actually thanked her, because none of this was hers to fix, and because 34 years of practice had taught me that the fastest way to survive an ambush is to keep your hands visible and your voice level until you're somewhere private enough to feel anything at all. I walked back through the lobby instead of toward table 9. I needed a minute, and I told myself it was just a minute. The lobby of the Cypress Bay Yacht Club had been rebuilt for the night into something closer to a campaign launch than a retirement dinner. A 6-foot banner hung between the 2 front columns, Nico Pharaoh for City Council. Cypress Bay's next generation, his face grinning out over the check-in table at 3 times life size, jaw set in the exact expression our father used for department photos. Beside it, smaller, almost an afterthought, a single framed photo of Hector in his old chief's uniform with a banner reading 31 years of service, like even his own retirement had been quietly repurposed into set dressing for his son's launch. I stood in front of that banner for longer than I meant to. Somewhere behind me, a string quartet was tuning up for the toasts. Somewhere behind that, a room full of people who had known me since I was 9 years old were about to spend an evening not noticing I wasn't in it. I thought about walking out to my car and just leaving. I actually had my hand on the strap of my bag when my work phone buzzed against my hip, not the soft double tap of a text, but the long, insistent pulse I'd assigned to exactly one category of alert. I pulled it out under the banner, half expecting a false positive, some pressure sensor twitching over nothing, anomaly detected, Cypress Bay Municipal Water, SCADA network, severity, monitoring, not an emergency. Not yet. Just a flicker, the kind of thing that resolved itself 9 times out of 10, but I read it twice anyway, the way I always did, and for the first time all night, the ache in my chest went quiet. Replaced by something colder and far more familiar, the particular, focused stillness of a system asking me, and only me, to pay attention. 10 years earlier, the trouble hadn't announced itself with an alert on a screen. It had come as a certified letter, and by the time it reached the kitchen table, it had already grown teeth. I was 24 then, 18 months into a job most people in Cypress Bay couldn't have named if you'd asked them. I mapped vulnerabilities in water and power systems for a regional consulting firm, the kind of work that only became visible when it failed. Nobody threw a parade for a firewall that held. My father was 2 years into his run as chief. He'd made an arrest that summer that should have been a career highlight, a warehouse burglary ring, 3 men in custody, his name in the paper twice in 1 week. Except one of those men hadn't done it, and the department's own dashcam footage, buried and then lost for 4 months, proved it. By the time the footage resurfaced, the wrongful arrest suit had already ballooned into something the city's insurance wouldn't fully cover, and Hector's household share of the settlement, the piece the city said was his personally, for failure to preserve evidence, came to just under $200,000. He told my mother it was handled. He told me nothing at all. I found out because Teresa called me crying in a grocery store parking lot, telling me the bank had sent a letter about the house, and could I please just look at it, because your father won't show me the paperwork and I don't understand any of it. I drove to Cypress Bay that weekend. I sat at their kitchen table, the same laminate table I'd done homework on, and read through a stack of documents thick enough to need a rubber band, and somewhere around page 11 I understood that my father was going to lose the house, his pension protections, and very possibly his job, in that order, unless somebody with actual leverage stepped in fast. I had that leverage. Not money, not yet, not really. I had something better in a small town, relationships. 3 years of contract work had put me in a room, more than once, with the outside counsel the city used for exactly this kind of exposure. I knew which senior partner actually read the files instead of skimming them. I knew how to write a memo that made a judge's clerk's job easier instead of harder. I spent 6 weeks building a case for a reduced personal settlement, using every professional favor I'd banked and a few I hadn't earned yet, and I did it without ever putting my name on a single filing, because Hector had made it clear, without ever quite saying it out loud, that having his daughter fix his mess would be worse than the mess itself. The night the reduced settlement came through, his personal liability cut by more than 2/3. Structured as a payment plan the family could actually survive, I sat at that same table while he signed it. He read every line twice. He asked good, careful questions, the questions of a man who'd spent 30 years learning not to sign anything blind. He never once asked how the number had gotten so much smaller than the number his own lawyer had quoted him 3 months earlier. Good outcome, he said, capping the pen. He looked at the paper, not at me. City finally did right by a good officer. I remember the particular quality of that silence. Not stunned, not grateful, just complete, like the sentence had answered a question nobody in the room had actually asked. That was the same year Nico's first restaurant went under. He came to that same kitchen a month later with a different kind of paperwork, a lease he'd co-signed without reading, a walk-in cooler repossessed with 3 days' notice, and he didn't ask me to fix it so much as assume, out loud, in front of both our parents, that I would. "You're good at this stuff," he said, like it was a compliment. I covered $11,000 of it that week, quietly, the way I'd already learned to do everything for this family, quietly, so nobody had to feel the weight of owing me anything. It was Hector, oddly, who first floated the idea of the trust. Not out of guilt, out of tidiness. He didn't like the family's finances running through his daughter's checking account like some kind of standing emergency fund. It embarrassed him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. So the following spring, we set up something more formal, a modest trust, seeded mostly with my money, nominally established to cover long-term care for my Aunt Rosa, Teresa's older sister, who had early-stage dementia and no children of her own. It gave the family a clean, respectable answer whenever anyone asked where the money came from. It gave me a way to keep helping without the helping showing on my face at Sunday dinner. I signed the trust documents at that table too. Teresa stood at the sink the whole time, drying a mixing bowl that had been dry for 10 minutes, watching us over her shoulder without turning around. She didn't ask a single question about how the fund would be managed, or who else might one day have access to it, or what would happen if someone decided Rosa's care could wait. She just kept drying that bowl, long after it had stopped needing it, the way she always did when she decided the safest thing in the room was to see nothing at all. 2 years ago, in the second week of a heat wave that had already killed 6 people in 3 counties, the grid did the thing every incident commander privately rehearses and never wants to see. It started failing exactly where the simulation said it would. I was 32, 8 months into running incident response for the regional utility co-op that kept the lights on for 4 counties, including Cypress Bay. It was 11:40 on a Tuesday night when the first alert came through, not a full outage, just a strange pattern of authentication failures on 3 substation controllers, the kind of noise that usually meant nothing. I almost let it wait until morning. I didn't. That instinct, the refusal to let anything wait, was the only reason what happened next didn't end with 100,000 people in 106-degree heat with no air conditioning. By midnight I was at the operations center, badge in, second monitor up, watching the noise turn into something with a shape. Whoever was inside our systems wasn't fumbling around. They were moving methodically from substation to substation, quietly locking out remote access one node at a time, the way you'd lock doors in a house room by room before setting it on fire. Ransomware, encrypting control system backups as it went, timed for a heat emergency because someone had done their homework on when a grid operator would be most desperate to pay rather than fight. I had 4 hours, maybe 5, before the encryption reached the load balancing systems that kept 3 substations from overloading each other during peak demand. After that, it wasn't a data problem. It was rolling blackouts in a heat wave, and rolling blackouts in a heat wave killed people who didn't have the luxury of a backup generator. I pulled 2 of my engineers in over video from their houses and started isolating segments of the network by hand, 1 firewall rule at a time, checking each substation's real-time load against what the intruders could still see before I cut it off. It was slow, deliberate work, closer to surgery than warfare, no dramatic countdown clock, just a spreadsheet of substation IDs and a decision, over and over, about which ones I could safely take offline for maintenance without tripping the exact cascading failure I was trying to prevent. At 1:52 in the morning, my personal phone lit up on the desk beside the keyboard. Nico, hey, can you send me $3K by Friday? Landlord's calling about the walk-in lease and I'm slammed getting the campaign filing stuff together. You're better with this money stuff anyway, lol. I looked at it for exactly as long as it took to read it once. Somewhere across the county, a woman on a ventilator at home was depending on a substation I hadn't finished isolating yet. My brother wanted $3,000 by Friday for a walk-in cooler on a restaurant that had already failed once, texted to me with a laughing emoji, at 2 in the morning. While I had blood pressure medication in my desk drawer I hadn't touched in years because I'd finally, mostly, learned how to keep my pulse where it belonged, I didn't answer. I set the phone face down on the desk, which was, for me, an act of open rebellion, and went back to the substation list. By 3:15, we'd isolated the compromised segments without losing a single substation to cascading failure. By 4 o'clock, I was on a call with the co-op's board chair, walking him through what we'd lost, some archived maintenance logs, nothing that touched customer data or live control, and what we'd have to rebuild by morning. By 5:30, with the sky just starting to go gray outside the operations center's one narrow window, I finally let myself sit back in the chair and feel my own heartbeat again, too fast, ragged at the edges, the particular exhaustion of a threat that never got to become a headline because it got stopped before it could. Nobody outside a small circle of engineers and one nervous board chair would ever know how close that night came to a different ending. I picked my phone back up around 6. I read Nico's message again, still sitting there, still cheerful, still oblivious to what the last 6 hours had actually been. I told myself I'd let it go unanswered on principle, that this, finally, was the line I wasn't going to cross again. By that Friday, I'd wired him the $3,000 anyway. Old habits didn't die because I wanted them to. They died, if they died at all, one refusal at a time, and I hadn't gotten there yet. The following week, the Cypress Bay Courier ran a front-page piece on local resilience during the heat emergency. It featured a photo of Nico standing in front of a refrigerated truck he'd arranged, at Hector's request, to shuttle ice and bottled water to 2 senior centers that had lost air conditioning during a 2-hour precautionary outage in an unrelated part of the grid, an outage that had nothing to do with the attack. That I'd authorized myself as a routine safety measure while the real threat was still being contained 30 miles away. The article called him a rising community leader who showed up when it mattered. It didn't mention the utility company by name. It didn't mention the co-op's incident response team. It certainly didn't mention me. Hector taped the clipping to the refrigerator. I saw it there 3 weeks later, at a Sunday dinner I almost didn't go to, hanging crooked under a magnet shaped like a seashell, and I stood in that kitchen for a long moment before anyone noticed I'd walked in, looking at my brother's face in newsprint, and felt something in my chest go quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the heat wave at all. The severity tag on the alert hadn't changed, still just monitoring, but I'd learned a long time ago not to trust that word too much. Monitoring was what a system called itself right up until it wasn't. I slipped out through the side exit instead of back through the ballroom, past a knot of servers restocking a raw bar, out into the humid dark of the yacht club's side lot. The band had started on something slow inside, the kind of song meant to ease people from champagne into course one. Through the tall windows I could see the room settling into its seats, my empty chair still empty at table 9, my mother's hand resting on the back of it like she was holding a place for someone who might still come. I pulled up the monitoring dashboard on my phone and watched 3 substation nodes blink amber instead of green. Still contained. Still probably nothing, a misconfigured patch, a contractor's laptop that shouldn't have had network access, the kind of thing that ate an hour of my night and resolved itself with an apologetic email in the morning. I was still watching the screen when it rang, and it wasn't the utilities system calling. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail. In 10 years, Teresa Farrow had called me directly maybe a dozen times, and 11 of those had been to ask if I was eating enough. But something in the timing snagged at me. She was 50 feet away inside that building. And she was calling instead of walking out to find me, Mari. Her voice had the thin, careful quality of someone reading off a script she hadn't finished writing. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react where anyone can see you. I'm outside. Go ahead. There was a long breath on the line, the kind that meant she was steadying herself against a wall somewhere, maybe the little alcove by the coat check where the noise from the band wouldn't carry. It's about your aunt's fund, she said. The one you set up for Rosa's care. My stomach did something slow and cold. What about it? Nico's been taking from it. For the campaign. Printing costs, the consultant. That fundraiser at the marina back in March. I found the statements when I was helping him organize his filing paperwork last week. I wasn't looking for anything, Mari. I promise you I wasn't looking. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I let the silence sit there instead of filling it for her, the way I would have 5 years ago. How much? I said. I don't. A lot. More than I want to say out loud in this hallway. A pause. Your father knows. He signed something. A guardianship reallocation, some kind of form, back in the spring. I saw his signature on it in the same folder. I stood very still in that parking lot, the string lights strung along the eaves throwing small warm circles onto the asphalt around my feet. And I let that land the way I let bad news land in a control room, not with a reaction, but with a sequence. First, is this confirmed? Second, what does it touch? Third, what happens if I do nothing at all? Rosa's fund wasn't large, not by the standards of anything that made headlines, but it was the only thing standing between my aunt and a Medicaid facility with a 4-year waiting list and a reputation I didn't want to think too hard about. It existed because I built it to exist. And somewhere in the last year, my father had put his name on paper that let my brother spend it on yard signs. Why didn't you say something when you found it? I asked. Not sharp. Just a question. The kind I'd ask a system log, because I didn't know what saying something would cost, Teresa said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she sounded like she meant it. Like the sentence had cost her something just to say out loud instead of drowning it in dish soap and running water the way she always had before. I still don't. I've watched this family for 30 years, Mari, and the only thing I've ever known how to do is keep the peace. I don't think I know how to do anything else. I could have told her what to do next. I could have told her to pull the statements, get them notarized, Take them to an attorney before Hector had time to paper over the gap the way he'd papered over worse. 10 years ago I would have already been in my car, already dialing someone, already fixing it before anyone had time to feel the weight of it themselves. I didn't do any of that. I stood in the string lights and let the quiet stretch out between us, and something in my chest that had been braced for a decade finally, quietly, let go of the rope. I'm not going to fix this one, Mom, I said. Not tonight, and not the way I've fixed everything else. You found it. You get to decide what you do with it. She didn't answer right away. I heard the band shift into something with more brass behind her, heard a burst of laughter from somewhere near the bar, ordinary gala noise closing back and around a conversation that had nothing ordinary in it at all. Okay, she finally said, so quietly I almost missed it under the music. Okay. I hung up and stood there a moment longer, looking back through the glass at the warm, expensive light of a room that didn't know yet what was sitting inside its own walls. Then my work phone buzzed again in my other hand, and this time it wasn't Amber. Confirmed intrusion, Cypress Bay water treatment, SCADA control layer, severity, critical. I read it once, and every soft, unfinished thing in my chest went quiet at once, replaced by the same flat, focused stillness I'd felt in 100 control rooms before this one. Not a drill. Not a nearby town's problem I could watch from a distance. This was Cypress Bay. This was the plant 3 miles from where I was standing in heels on a gravel lot, and somewhere inside that building, right now, someone who wasn't supposed to have access was already moving. I called my deputy incident commander, Dana Whitfield, before I'd even finished reading the alert twice. She picked up on the second ring, already halfway into her car from the sound of it. Confirmed intrusion, control layer, she said, no preamble. Someone's inside the chlorination dosing system. If they push the wrong command, we're either poisoning the output or shutting the whole plant down blind. I've got a team spinning up remote isolation now, but I need your sign-off to cut public-facing telemetry. That takes us dark to the state dashboard for however long this runs. Do it, I said. Cut it. I'll take the call with the state if they ask. For the next 40 minutes, I stood in that parking lot in a navy cocktail dress and low heels, phone against my ear, walking Dana and 2 engineers through a segmentation plan I'd drawn up in my head 100 times in drills and never once had to use for real. We isolated the dosing controller first, then the SCADA historian, cutting the intruder's visibility one system at a time while keeping the actual treatment process running on manual, safe defaults. It was the same discipline as the ransomware night 2 years ago, just faster, meaner. With less time to think and a great deal more at stake, because water didn't forgive the way a delayed grid restoration did. At 9:52, the intruder's access dropped off our monitoring entirely. Not because they'd left. Because we'd locked every door they'd come in through. I was still confirming the last isolation with Dana when a black Suburban pulled into the yacht club's front circle, lights not flashing but engine running hot, and a woman in a windbreaker with county emergency management stitched across the back got out and looked directly at me like she'd been given a description. Mari Farrow, she said. I'm Renata Cole, Regional EM Liaison. Your team called it in as contained. But county wants eyes on the ground and a briefing for the officials who are supposed to be finding out about this from us instead of the news. She glanced past me toward the glowing windows of the gala. I understand your father's inside. He is, I said, then I need him, and I need whoever's running this event, in the next 5 minutes. I walked her in through the side door I'd used to leave. The band was between songs. Hector was at the head table with a glass raised halfway to a toast he hadn't started yet, and Nico stood beside the podium in a suit that had clearly been chosen for photographs, campaign banner glowing behind him under the stage lights. Renata didn't wait for an introduction. She crossed the room in a straight line, badge already out, and the volume of the room fell in a ragged wave as 300 people noticed a stranger in an emergency management windbreaker walking toward the head table like she owned the floor. Chief Farrow. She said it loud enough to carry, not unkindly, just with the flat clarity of someone used to briefing rooms. Sorry to interrupt. County had a confirmed cyber intrusion on the water treatment SCADA system tonight. It's been contained. I wanted you and city leadership to hear that directly from us before it hits anyone's phone as a rumor. Hector set his glass down too fast. Wine slopped over the rim onto the white tablecloth. A small dark stain spreading outward that nobody moved to blot. Contained, he repeated. Contained by who? Renata glanced at me, apparently assuming I'd already be standing beside her, which I was. By Marisol Ferro's team, she said. She ran point on the isolation from the moment we got the first anomaly report. If she hadn't caught the early indicators 2 hours ago and had her people ready to move the second it escalated, we'd be looking at a public health notice tonight instead of a briefing. The room didn't gasp. It did something quieter and stranger, a slow, rippling stillness, 300 conversations dying at slightly different moments as the sentence traveled table by table. I watched my father's face do the arithmetic in real time. The daughter he'd had erased from the seating chart 3 hours ago was the reason nobody in this room, or in the 4,000 households downstream of that plant, was drinking contaminated water tonight. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He looked, for several long seconds, like a man trying to remember how his own face was supposed to work. Nico hadn't moved from beside the podium. His campaign banner glowed behind him, Nico Ferro for City Council, and under it he stood very still, the launch speech he'd rehearsed for weeks now stranded somewhere behind his teeth with nowhere left to go. Through the tall windows behind him, I could see the county suburban's parking lights still on outside, and past that, faintly, the wash of red and blue from 2 utility response vehicles idling near the service entrance. Nobody had turned to look at the banner in a long time. Renata gave a short, practical rundown, no ongoing risk to the water supply, a full incident report to follow within 72 hours. Questions could go through the county's public information officer, and then she found me again with her eyes. I'll need you back at the operations center once you can get away. Good work tonight. She said it like a colleague, not like a toast, which was somehow the thing that finally made my throat tighten. She left the way she'd come in. The room stayed quiet a beat longer than was comfortable, then filled back in with the low, uncertain murmur of people who didn't know whether to clap, whisper, or pretend they hadn't just watched a woman's entire evening get rewritten in 90 seconds. I didn't wait to see what Hector would do with it. I walked back out through the side door, needing air that wasn't full of 100 people recalculating who I was. I made it as far as the service hallway behind the kitchen before Nico caught up to me. He'd taken off his suit jacket at some point, tie loosened, and up close I could see his hands weren't quite steady. You knew, he said. Not loud. The hallway was narrow enough that he didn't need to be. Tonight. Before that woman walked in. You already knew something was happening and you didn't say anything to me or Dad. I knew there was an anomaly, I said. I didn't know it was going to end up being announced over your launch. That's not, he stopped, started again. Mom told you. About the account. Didn't she? I didn't answer that directly. I didn't need to, the answer was already sitting in his face, in the particular way his jaw worked when he realized I wasn't going to make this easier for him by pretending I hadn't heard. How much of it is left? I asked. Quiet. Not a demand. A question, the way I'd ask it of a system that had already told me most of what I needed to know. Nico's mouth opened, then closed. He looked, for a moment, exactly the way he'd looked as a kid caught doing something he already understood was indefensible, before he'd learned how to talk his way past it. I was going to pay it back, he said. After the election. Once the donor numbers came in, I had a plan. I just needed the runway to. Rosa doesn't have runway, Nico. I kept my voice level. Not cruel. Just accurate. She has a fund that either exists or doesn't. On the day the facility bill comes due, he didn't have an answer for that. He stood there in the narrow hallway with the kitchen noise humming behind the door and the sound of the band starting up again, muffled. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, and for the first time since I'd walked in and found my name missing from a printed program, I watched my brother finally do the math himself, in full, with nobody standing beside him to soften the total. The county's incident report went public 11 days later, 3 paragraphs of dry technical language that credited the regional incident response team, led by M. Farrow, with preventing what it carefully called a significant public health exposure event. Nobody in Cypress Bay who mattered failed to read between those 3 paragraphs. By the following week, my name had shown up in 2 council meeting minutes, a state infrastructure grant application, and a phone call from a reporter at the Courier that I let go to voicemail. Hector's legacy project, a decade-old push to modernize the town's water infrastructure with federal funds, the thing he'd planned to announce at his own retirement, before a different announcement beat him to it, needed a signed risk assessment from a qualified regional authority before the state would release $1 of the grant. There was exactly 1 person in 4 counties whose signature satisfied that requirement without a 6-month wait for an outside contractor. Nico's campaign, meanwhile, had built its entire platform around infrastructure resilience, using language his own team had lifted almost verbatim from a press release my office put out that spring. His fundraising emails now referenced the water system incident directly, framing it as proof Cypress Bay needed leaders who understood these systems, without ever using my name, because using my name would have meant explaining why his own sister wasn't on his contact list anymore. Both of them needed something from me now. Neither of them called to ask for it directly. Hector's office sent a formal request through the Utility Co-op's General Counsel, addressed to my title instead of my name. Nico's campaign manager emailed my professional address, CCANG, 2 people I'd never met, requesting a brief supportive quote for a mailer. I signed Hector's risk assessment. Not for him, for the 4,000 households the funding would actually protect. The same reason I'd have signed it for any qualified project in the region. I sent it back through council, the same channel it had arrived through, with nothing attached but my signature and the required certifications. I did not send Nico a quote. The invitation to dinner came from Teresa, and it came by phone, which told me something before she said a word. Your father wants everyone together, she said. Sunday. Nothing formal, just all of us at the house. A pause, longer than the sentence needed. I want you to come too, but I want you to know I mean that separately from whatever he wants. That was new. In 34 years, my mother had never once drawn a line between what she wanted and what the room wanted. I let the distinction sit there and take up the space it deserved before I answered. What made you say it that way? I asked. Because I've spent a long time deciding what was safe to want, she said, quiet, like she was still working out whether she believed the sentence herself. I'm trying to stop doing that. It's slower than I thought it would be. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me in that kitchen or out of it, and some old, tired part of my chest wanted badly to reward her for it, to say yes, to drive up Sunday, to sit at that table one more time and watch whether anything about it had actually changed. I let myself feel but pull all the way through instead of shutting it down early. Because I'd learned that shutting it down early was its own kind of lying to myself. I'm not coming Sunday, I said. Not because of you. I mean that. But I'm not walking back into a dinner where the reason I'm welcome is a signature on a grant application. She didn't argue. Okay, she said again, the same word she'd used in the parking lot weeks earlier, and this time it didn't sound like surrender. It sounded like someone practicing a muscle she hadn't used in a long time. I'll see you, I told her. Just not there. Not yet. I hung up and didn't call back, and I didn't feel the old ache to fix the distance between us into something smaller and more comfortable. It stayed exactly the size it was. My new office sat on the 2nd floor of a converted warehouse 2 blocks off the water, windows facing the bay instead of the town, a name on the door that belonged to no one but me. Cypress Coastal Resilience Group had 3 employees, 1 signed county contract, and a waiting list of 2 smaller municipalities who'd heard what happened in Cypress Bay and wanted someone who could tell the difference between a real threat and a nuisance alert before it cost them a heat wave or a poisoned reservoir. On a Tuesday evening in late fall, with the light going gold and flat across the water outside my window, I sat at my own desk and reviewed the final risk certification for a neighboring county's grid hardening project. New client. New contract, a name nobody in my family had ever heard. I read it through twice, the way I read everything that mattered. Then I signed it, Marisol Farrow. Nothing after it. No inherited title, no family legacy riding along beside the letters, no one else's name required to make it mean something. I set the pen down and looked out at the bay a while before I filed it.